Hello, my name is Panos Mavromatis, and I am the Director of Music Theory for Music and Performing Arts here. Our program is a service program that serves all music majors and, of course, all other non-majors who want to participate. And we cover, on one hand, the basic core theory curriculum, as we say. That includes theory and ear training. Theory involves various kinds of writing and analysis skills. Ear training involves sight singing and dictation recognition skills. In addition to the core curriculum, we offer a number of different electives at a more advanced level usually, and these include counterpoint, these include a theory seminar in various topics such as Schenkerian analysis and various types of 20th century theory. Let me tell you a little bit about my background. I am trained as a musician, and I also have some background in science, which is not uncommon in our field. And
you're a physicist.
yeah, I have a degree in physics in particular, and this has influenced my approach to some extent.
In what way?
I think that music theory can benefit from a scientific approach. One of the traditional views of music theory is that we study the grammar or the language of music, but another view that's somewhat more modern is that we're actually studying the skill of the people that make the music, and in trying to understand what makes for a good musical skill, it's natural to invoke the methods of psychology, for example, of music psychology, and to study skill in the ways that other sciences study skill. For me, music theory is, first of all, even before going to the research component, music theory is something that relates to our musicality, our skill, and our intuition. I could think of this as a way of verbalizing, finding means to verbalize our musical intuitions and our musical skill. In a way that would make it more concrete and more accessible to us. To give you a simple example, the sense of hearing is in some ways somewhat underprivileged. In music, we have to study to do ear training and distinguish a certain musical object from another in a way that we never have to do it with our eyes. Say, we never train to distinguish a triangle from a square. We learn that as very young, and it stays with us. Without music theory, the basics of musical skill, such as recognizing certain musical objects, cannot stay with us. We don't have the language to give it concrete form and to be able to transmit it. Now, this could find immediate application, say, in a simple task, and this is one of many examples where you want to recognize and remember something. Assume you're hearing a theme, say, for first time, and chances are that many weeks later you're not going to be able to just exactly recall that tune if you've never heard it before. But if you can analyze it and say, oh, okay, this was such and such harmonic progression, and the melody does such and such on top, then immediately you have some verbal apparatus to characterize it, then you can remember that for the rest of your life. And likewise, think of being a composer and or improviser. You do something that's very interesting. If you don't have the language to describe it and understand it, it's gone. You know, it evaporates. So music theory tries to make concrete in that particular way the evanescent aspect of musicality, which is our intuition or our skill. Very often this is things that are very automatic to a skilled person. They just do it, something that traditionally has been called talent. You know, a very good example, very often in the past people would think of the ear training skills as talent, and if you have it or you don't. And of course, it's a very disappointing thing to say as a teacher, like, oh, you either have it or you don't. The question of modern music theory is how can we break down this skill, understand it, give it some kind of rational structure, and then teach ourselves and our teachers to develop the skill to the student who may or may not have it. Same thing with composition, same thing with improvisation and certain kinds of instrumental skill. The age where we said, oh, Mozart, he was somewhere out there, I think it's gone, and nowadays modern theory can articulate what Mozart had was building into his musical structures, and something that we can invite our students to consider. Of course, that doesn't mean that you will become Mozart, overnight, but at least that suggests certain paths, certain things to do. Ear training is, of course, a very important skill to develop and somewhat tricky to do on your own. That's why I think a good class is essential. For one thing, ear training involves what we call dictation, which means be able to recognize an unknown tune that you hear. And you basically have to have someone to play to you this unknown tune so that you can write it down. Of course, you can do that off records, but in a classroom situation, this is more controlled and manageable because you can ask the teacher to play it again, and you can focus in a strategic way. Of course, if you don't have access to a classroom, one of the things you can do to develop your dictation skill is to do it from recordings, try to do transcriptions. Maybe if the whole thing is overwhelming, trying to focus on a specific aspect, like take the top line, the tune, the melody, and try to write it down. Of course, again, without a teacher, you don't know what the right answer would be. Later, you can go and find the score, maybe. So that's one way, although, this may be the long and frustrating path that is certainly worth taking, trying to transcribe things that, even without recordings, you can do tunes that you happen to have in your head, like famous tunes, Happy Birthday to You. You probably have never seen it written. Few people have, because we don't need it. It's a tune that flies around all the time, and even pianists can pick it by ear. Well, why don't you try to write it down, this and any other famous tunes? Then you can check your work by actually trying to play it, and see if your transcription was correct, if not, how to improve it. So that's a simple solution to develop some ear training skills outside of a classroom situation. In terms of sight reading, things are a little easier perhaps because you can always take a single line. Of course, if you're proficient in some kind of instrument, like the keyboard, you can try first to sing that line without hearing it being played. And then play it and compare, see what kinds of where you made mistakes and why you think you made a mistake. Of course, again, it's hard to substitute for an experienced teacher who would be able to guide you through this process, but this is the way I would handle it. Concerning the ways that physics and science could interact with music theory and ways that could help, there's many different ways. Acoustics is only one aspect of it, and perhaps the one that's best explored. Of course, we know that musical instruments are sound systems that have certain acoustical properties. We can learn to understand many traditional ideas, such as an instrument's articulation, timbre, ways of making sound like embouchure in terms of physics, and that can be very helpful to the performer to be aware of the physics of their instrument. In our department, we have a course in voice pedagogy that's meant to teach vocalists how to teach voice. That's trying to also give them awareness of the acoustics of a voice, and we have the Department of Speech and Speech Pathology here, which has all the necessary instruments, so we can have our vocalists sing into an instrument and see the acoustical characteristics of the voice production, and to see the strengths and drawbacks through this acoustical approach. This is one thing you can do with acoustics, and it goes on and on. We can talk about concert hall acoustics and what the conductor needs to be aware of. We can talk about what the composer needs to be aware of. Especially nowadays, we have all those means for electronic sound production, and so you can literally make sound from its raw materials. And the knowledge of physics would show you what are good ways to combine those electronically generated elements. This is not what I do. What I do is I study what could be described as the thought process and decision making that goes into musical skill. For example, one project that I've been pursuing recently involves the improvisation skill in a specific musical tradition, Greek church chant. In fact, I'm Greek, and I have had direct exposure to this tradition. I've been growing up with that kind of music. What I've tried to do, and what's interesting about that tradition, first of all, is that a lot of the knowledge is transmitted orally by example. Nobody has sat down to write down the rules of improvisation. We have some general rules, like what the scales are, what the intervals are, but the rest people just pick up by ear, by listening to their teacher and trying to reproduce that. Well, isn't that the way we learn how to speak too? We do it by imitating. And later, linguists come and tell us, these are the rules of language, and we can apply some kind of mathematical analysis to come up with the rules of language. All the linguist has is the examples of people speaking, and the linguist knows what sounds right and what sounds wrong. If I make an ungrammatical sentence, something's wrong there. I can describe mathematically the structure that it gives you a correct sentence versus a wrong sentence. This is what I'm trying to do with musical grammar, so to speak. And that grammar is generally internalized, and that's what makes it challenging. If it's something that we'd speak about, or just ask the people what do you do and why. And a lot of that we can do, but there's so many interesting things about musical skill that we can't speak about. We have to just watch people, and we have to infer how their mind operates. So this is how I use my math in a nutshell. And then I can even do some kind of computer simulation, meaning I have a test program that pretends to be a singer and improviser, and see if my program produces a tune that's faithful to the tradition, that could be, recognized by someone native to the tradition. Then I know that the rules I've discovered are right. If the program gives you, something irrelevant, then that shows you that my rules may be wrong and have to be fixed. So in that way, I'm actually using the computer to analyze vast quantities of data, and also to try to predict the consequences of our theories. So that's one particular aspect that I'm interested in. In relation to the use of the computer, I'm very interested in so-called tutoring systems, where the computer can actually assist the teaching process by monitoring the student performing a solution to a musical problem, and discovering what the steps are and what the correct steps are, what the missteps are, and how to fix that. So it gives you a little bit of a flavor of the kinds of uses I've put my scientific background to. Chomsky was one of the founders of modern linguistics, and he set as his goal to understand the psychology of language production, language acquisition and production. And in doing that, Chomsky was well aware that he was not only looking at an abstract symbolic characterization of what is a correct or incorrect grammatical sentence, but he's also making a statement about our language faculty, so to speak, our ability to make and perceive language. In the same way, I'm not simply interested in doing an analysis of, although that's the necessary first, although it is a necessary first step to do an analysis of the score of the musical object itself, the next step is to figure out what that musical object, that musical output tells us about the mind that made it. And in that sense, I think my work is influenced by Chomsky. In terms of the historical scope of our theoretical tools, there's two sides traditionally to the way we teach music theory. We teach so-called tonal theory and so-called non-tonal or post-tonal theory. And whereas tonal theory is a very focused body of knowledge that focuses mostly on the so-called common practice period, that's roughly the period from Bach to Brahms, and forms the standard for our standard harmony, forms the curriculum for our standard harmony courses. 20th century music is a much more varied landscape. This is because there's no single language and unified technique that can characterize everything that's happened in the 20th century. There were so many different schools, so many different approaches to perhaps the very similar set of problems, like how to move, what are the next logical steps beyond tonality. And as a result, our theory is more of a potpourri of different approaches. Some composer theorists have articulated certain directions, like 12-tone theory, but it would be wrong to assume that 12-tone theory is the only factor, say, just because it was a lot more was actually written about it and was much better articulated. It turns out that it's one possible direction out of many. We do have some general tools, like set theory, so-called set theory, that tries to, that attempts an abstract approach to post-tonal music, some common denominator. So in teaching 20th century theory, it's important to be aware of a breadth of different tools rather than find the one correct orthodox approach. In fact, this is a sensitive issue because in some ways this is many living compositional systems would be involved here, and in no way are we in a position to say that this is the way you should write today. You should write using 12-tone rows, or you should be writing using 12-tone, you should be writing using sets. Just like our compositional attitude nowadays is somewhat eclectic, you come in with a different background, you have a whole spectrum of different techniques in front of you, like aleatoric or minimalist or you name it, and you choose your own language as a special blend of or you choose your own language you choose to keep, or something or not. Likewise, in terms of analysis, we should have a broad spectrum of techniques and try to be able to pursue a number of different alternatives. There's no single correct analytical approach, the same way as there's an established analytical approach for tonal music. Unfortunately, the way, let's ditch the word unfortunately, the way theory has developed is there are certain time periods that have been very well understood and other time periods that are only tentatively covered theoretically. Much of what happens before Bach, for example, is analyzed is not analyzed a lot in standard theory curriculum because there are no standard theoretical tools. This is a more specialized area, and you can take seminars on that topic. One exception is perhaps Counterpoint, that has focused on a specific style of the 16th century, and we have a very good system of rules that can approach that style, but they're big areas in past historical styles that are not quite covered. Likewise, in 20th century styles, a lot has been covered, but not all of it in equal depth. So unfortunately, ditch unfortunately. Our music theory remains focused on certain model periods that we can draw important lessons from. The goal of the theory program, which is, as I said earlier, a service program that serves the entire music and performing arts community, the goal of our program is to develop in our students the musical skills necessary to go and pursue their careers in terms of ear training, being able to hear and respond to what they hear in a real situation, including a performance situation where you have to be very quick and efficient at recognizing and responding and producing music. In terms of theory and analysis, written theory and analysis, this is one of the best ways to articulate your musical intuitions. If you are playing in a chamber ensemble, for example, and you want to communicate with your partners a certain decision, having a theoretical language to do that makes you all the more efficient. And of course, being an educator of any sort, it's absolutely indispensable that you have the appropriate language to verbalize your musical intuitions. There are some differences in terms of what each major may require, but the basic core theory sequence is the same for everybody because it gives you the foundations to build from it in different directions. If you're a jazz major, you will also take some jazz theory that's offered by the jazz program. If you want to have a special focus, you can take one of our theory specialized electives, like the theory seminar, or pursue another course within your own program. But the core theory sequence is some common denominator that we believe every good musician should share, whether they end up doing musical theater or instrumental performance, classical or jazz. Earlier I mentioned that a lot of our musicality is developed without our being verbal about it, and I made the analogy of language. Well, your question is a perfect instance of that. We do know that if we were exposed to a certain style of music, we develop intuitions about that style of music. And even before we know even the musical alphabet, the first thing about musical theory, we may be able to say, oh, this sounds like Bach, this sounds like Mozart. Now, these are very complex aspects of musical skill that happen in this possibly untrained person's head. And it is a job of music theory to also make us understand exactly that. You would say, why do we need that? If we can develop the intuition, I say to you that if you can actually understand your intuition, you're all the more powerful. But this is an important point because this shows you that our students don't go into our theory class empty of skill or intuition. In fact, they have something that they have a lot of background already built into their skills, just like anybody who walks into a grammar class as a kid has the language capacity built into them already. So it's the challenge of our music theory teachers to be able to extract those kinds of musical intuitions from our students, things that they already may have, and to be able to shape it, to take this as a starting point. Of course, having said that, the more theory, the more explicit theory and the more verbal theory you can actually build, the more sophisticated your intuition is going to become as well. So it's some kind of feedback circle. So theory doesn't mean abandon your intuition, it gives you a whole new platform to develop your intuition. I agree that music theory can be taught in such a way as to become unpleasant. And this is precisely when music theory becomes detached from our intuitive response to music, then it becomes a game of symbols, and a boring one at that, because if you like to play with symbols, you might go and do math, which is probably more interesting. But to turn a musical exercise into notes and stuff without connecting it to the skill that goes into it and comes out of it has the danger of making music theory a boring subject. So I think the answer is to try to connect our students to their skill and to make them, to show them that they will benefit in that way. Incidentally, what supports what you said earlier is the fact that typically the complaints are for the written theory. Everybody agrees that ear training is good. Why? Because they understand it's a skill thing. Likewise, we want to make our written theory appear like it's something that will immediately impact their musicality, and it's not just a game to be played with symbols and pencil and paper. Ideally, a performer should be able to pick up a score and have enough theory as they might need as a performer. Different different areas of expertise, different areas of specialization may have different needs. If you're a composer, you will need to take a look at the score to see what another composer did and learn from that. And so you'll look at things through your lens as a composer. If you're a performer, you're again going to look at things from performer's perspective. And a core theoretical a set of core theoretical tools is a common denominator, of course. So I would say yes, the composer does need to have those tools. If you don't have that, you end up just listening to lots of recordings and doing whatever X pianist or Y pianist does. If you can analyze the score, that gives you the power to look at things and make your own decisions. I think, and that's why it's important. It's especially true for conductors because, in a sense, they're in charge of, in an orchestral situation, it would be tolerated to have a non-understanding musician who's simply good at following instructions, but the conductor has to know what they're doing. Of course, ideally, the orchestral musicians themselves have to be educated so that the conductor can start from there and build on top of that. You don't want to simply have to, have to go to the basics. So, but the conductor is particularly important because it has the responsibility of the final product. Likewise, a chamber musician when there's no conductor or a soloist. There are certain parts of the core theory curriculum that are sort of settled at this point, and you can teach core theory without necessarily being aware of the latest in music theory research. But for me, the ideal is that ultimately research expands our horizons, and then that percolates back to the lower levels of theory teaching. Put it another way, good research very often makes us question the fundamentals, and then you can go back and restructure your presentation of the fundamentals geared toward your ultimate goal, which is a deeper understanding. Things like that have happened in traditional conservatory instruction. For example, the way we teach harmony today is not the same as the way we taught harmony 50 years ago. What has happened since then is that so-called Schenkerian theory has gained ground, especially here in the States, but by now everywhere, which gives you a deeper insight into what made the great composers' music tick. In the 70s, Schenker theory was an exotic research topic. Nowadays, every harmony textbook is informed by Schenkerian theory. Not necessarily that you have to include the basic concepts of Schenkerian theory, but the way you present fundamentals is colored by Schenkerian theory and sort of naturally leads toward the more, the later stages in someone's theory education. I think it's simply a difference in degree rather than difference in kind. For example, you can take the first two levels of a theory sequence there and teach a successful high school course that's consistent with that. We certainly don't have to have the unpleasant situation of high school students who've started music theory on the wrong track, so to speak, and we have to they have to unlearn things as they come into our sequence. That's usually a very hard process, but I haven't encountered that in practice. I think that students who land here in our school generally, well, we have a type of student who simply hasn't taken theory before. There are some majors, in which case we can start them from the beginning. We have a so-called basic musicianship course. They can start them at the beginning, but those people who have had some music theory in high school, they come in with in very good shape to join our sequence. It's surprising to see that more and more students come with advanced placement, and they can even skip a theory class. I think it only reinforces the point that I made earlier, that our intuition is ahead of our intellect, and this is always going to be the case. But if we stay at the level of intuition, we'll be limited. It's great that people try out things before they learn all the necessary theory. Then when you teach them theory, you can appeal to their intuitions. Very much like when you teach grammar in school, you teach people who already know how to speak. But if you don't get to the point where you know grammar explicitly and theoretically, you'll never become a writer or a poet. You'll only be so limited. And then again, language may not be totally perfect an analogy here, but because you can conceivably have a writer who's never gone to school, who has never taken grammar in school, that would be sort of a little exceptional. But with music, I would strongly encourage people to start doing music before they get into the theory class, and then they'll have all the more experience to relate to what they learn in theory. However, to just say, oh, intuition's therefore sufficient by itself, I don't think it is. With music theory, your intuition can become richer and then stretch your theory further and further, so it's more of a feedback circle.